I have spent 40 years of my life building walls that nothing living could cross, and I want the board to understand, before I say anything else, that the walls were not the problem. The walls at Vault Sarn were the finest work the Sayar cordon ever poured. I signed the tolerances myself. I am not here to tell you a story about a failure of engineering. I am here to tell you that we quarantined the wrong thing, that we did not even know what kind of thing it was, and that by the time I understood what had come through my clean corridors, it had already touched every cell on the tier, and there was no filter in the catalog that could take it out of the air. Let me begin the way the record begins, because the record is honest even where I was not. The subject arrived on the third day of the cold quarter, offloaded from a cordon interdiction cutter that had put down a raider skirmish on a border world we had no name for yet. Standard practice. When our patrols secure a contested surface, they sweep the survivors, and any survivor whose biology triggers the Death World flags goes into isolation transport and comes to a place like mine. Humans trip every flag we have. Their blood carries organisms that would end most of the cordon's member species in a single breath. Their skin is a garden. Their gut is a sealed war we do not pretend to understand. When the manifest said human, I did what I had done 100 times. I cleared a hard cell on the second ring, set the containment field to full opacity, and told my staff to treat the arrival as a live pathogen source until the panels said otherwise. She came down the intake corridor on her own feet, which I noted and dismissed. Restraints, of course. A field of soft blue light around the litter that would have collapsed her lungs if she had tried to cross it. She was small. That surprised the junior warden beside me, who had read the Deathworld dossiers and expected something with more teeth in it. Humans do not have impressive teeth. They have a face that is almost all expression, and hers, when the litter turned so I could log her features for the file, was doing something I did not have a category for. She was looking at the two panicked prisoners in the transit holds we passed, a Sethel raider and a broken-winged Aku, both of them screaming inside their fields, and her face had gone soft in a way I understood only much later. She was not afraid of them. She was sorry for them. I wrote calm on the intake sheet. That was the first word of this, and I did not know it was a symptom. Her designation in our records is Subject Vance, human, female, occupation stated as field medic. She gave the occupation herself, through the translation bridge unprompted, the way a person tells you a true thing because they have decided lying is more work than it is worth. Della Vance. I use the name now because the board has read the file and there is no point pretending she was only a number. She was a number for the first 2 days. After that she was a problem with a name, and after that she was the reason I am standing in front of you. The panels came back clean. I want to be precise, because Analyst Dahl will correct me if I am not. They did not come back empty. They came back full of the ordinary human horror show, the 1,000 quiet organisms, the resilient cellular architecture, the marrow that our imaging could not fully resolve because it kept doing things imaging is not supposed to record. But clean, in the only sense that matters to a containment physician. There was no agent present that explained the alarm the cutter's medic had filed. The cutter's medic had flagged her not for a wound, not for a fever, not for anything on a scanner. He had flagged her because in the 11 hours of transport, his own crew, hardened interdiction troopers who had just come off a killing floor, had stopped shaking, had eaten, had slept. He wrote in the margin of the manifest, in the clipped hand of a man who does not want to be laughed at, that the human did something to the hold and I could not stop it. Then he flagged her as a possible biological vector and washed his hands of her, which is the correct instinct and the wrong diagnosis, and I made the same one for far longer than he did. I read that margin note and I dismissed it. I have read a great many margin notes from frightened crews. A soldier comes off a border world and everything looks like a weapon to him. I assumed the man had confused relief with contagion. Relief is common after violence. It is not a pathogen. I ordered the standard 40-cycle observation hold. assigned her the second ring cell with the reinforced field, and turned my attention to the 11 other active cases on the tier, which were, at that time, far more interesting than a small human woman with clean panels. Here is what the isolation tier at Vault Sarn is, so the younger members of this board understand what I am claiming failed. It is a wheel. The hub is the physician's gallery where I sat, ringed by telemetry. Around the hub run 3 concentric rings of cells, each cell its own sealed atmosphere, its own scrubbers, its own field. Nothing moves between cells. Nothing moves between a cell and the corridor except through a triple lock and a sterilization cycle that would strip the paint off a hull. We have held things on that tier that could have ended a homeworld. We held the ninefold rot in the third ring for 200 days and lost not a single technician. We held the thing from Corvin Deep that eats the sheaths off nerves, and we held it so well that most of the cordon has forgotten it ever got loose. The tier is not a prison, though we hold prisoners in it. It is a lung that only breathes one way. Whatever comes in, stays in. That was the promise of the architecture, and until Subject Vance the architecture had never broken that promise, not once, not by a hair. So you will understand my patience in the beginning. A clean human in a cell that had held the Corvin thing was not a crisis. It was paperwork. I expected to log 40 cycles of nothing and put her on a repatriation or disposal review with the border authority and forget her name inside a quarter. On the 6th cycle, the ward went quiet. I mean that in the technical sense first. The tier is never silent. Isolation does terrible things to caged minds, and the second and third rings are always loud with it. The Cethal Raider in Cell 9 had been throwing himself at his field for 6 days. The Aku in Cell 12 had not stopped its keening since intake, and there were 4 others in various stages of the collapse that isolation always brings. This is expected. We do not medicate it unless it threatens the subject's survival, because sedation corrupts the panels. The tier is a place of screaming. That is baseline. Analyst Dahl has the acoustic logs and can confirm that the mean sound pressure on the second ring, across the 400 cycles before Subject Vance, held within a narrow and miserable band. On the 6th cycle, it dropped below that band, and it did not come back up. I noticed it the way you notice a machine that has stopped, not the sound, but the absence where the sound had been. I pulled the acoustic history and saw the fall, and my first assumption was equipment. A scrubber fault, a sensor drift, a bad channel. I sent a technician to walk the ring. She came back and told me the ring was quiet because the prisoners were quiet. The Cethal Raider in Cell 9, who had bloodied himself against his field for 6 straight days, was sitting against the back wall with his eyes half closed. The Aku had stopped keening. Cell by cell, the second ring had gone still, and no one had done anything to make it happen. No sedation, no intervention, nothing on any log. I asked the technician what had changed on the ring. She was quiet for a moment, in the way my staff learned to be quiet in those weeks, and then she said the only new thing on the ring was the human. I told her that was not a mechanism. A human in a sealed cell does not calm a Cethal Raider 40 measures away through 2 atmospheres in a field. There is no pathway. Sound does not carry between the cells, the fields see to that. Scent does not carry, the scrubbers see to that. There is no line of sight. Whatever was happening on my ring, the human in the opaque cell could not be the cause of it because there was no channel through which she could be a cause. I said this with confidence. I want that confidence in the record, because it is the shape of the mistake, and the mistake is the lesson. I was thinking like a physician who hunts organisms. I was looking for a vector, a droplet, a surface, a bite, a shared filter. I had spent 40 years learning that contagion needs a road, and I had spent 40 years closing roads, and I had closed every road into that cell myself. So when the tier went quiet, I did not think contagion. I thought coincidence, and I logged it as coincidence, and I moved on. The board has the telemetry from the 7th through the 11th cycles. I will not read all of it. I will tell you what it showed, because it is the heart of the case, and then I will tell you the moment I stopped being able to call it coincidence. Every subject on the tier wears a passive monitor. It reports the ordinary things: respiration, core temperature, the electrical weather of the heart, whatever passes for these in the subject's species. We collect this to know when a caged thing is dying. We do not ordinarily look at it together. There is no reason to compare the heart rhythm of a Cethal raider to the heart rhythm of an Aku. They are different animals, and their monitors sit in different columns of the file, and no physician in the history of the cordon has ever had a reason to lay those columns side by side. Analyst Dahl laid them side by side. I want the record to note that it was his idea and not mine, because it was the single act of imagination that broke this case open, and I was not imaginative enough to have it. He was chasing the scrubber fault I had ordered him to find, and to rule out a shared atmosphere event, he pulled the respiration traces for the whole second ring and stacked them. And he came to my gallery, and he did not say anything. He only put the stacked traces in front of me, and I looked at them for a long time. They were converging. On the sixth cycle, the 6 subjects of the second ring had been breathing as 6 separate animals, each in its own rhythm, its own panic, its own private weather. By the 9th cycle, the 6 traces were folding toward one another. Not identical, you cannot make a Cethal breathe like an Aku, but phase-locked, the way 2 badly tuned engines will, over hours, begin to shudder in time. And when Dahl overlaid the 7th trace, the one from the opaque cell on the inner edge of the ring, I saw that the 5 caged animals were not converging toward some average. They were converging toward her. Subject Vance's respiration was the slow, deep, metronomic rhythm at the center of the fold, and one by one, cell by cell, through sealed atmospheres and dead fields and 40 measures of vacuum-rated wall, the others were falling into step with it. I have built walls my whole life. I know what a wall stops. A wall stops a thing that has mass or charge or the need for a medium. I sat in my gallery and I looked at those converging lines and I understood, with the specific cold that I have felt only a handful of times in 40 years, that whatever was crossing my ring had none of those needs. It did not have mass. It did not need my air. It was moving through my subjects, not through my atmosphere, and I had built the finest containment in the cordon around a thing that did not care about containment at all. I still did not know what it was, but I knew on the 9th cycle that it was real and that it had a direction, and that the direction was outward from her. We did what containment physicians do when a vector reveals a road. We cut the road. The obvious channel, whatever my confidence about the fields, was the observation comm. Each cell has a one-way audio bleed to the gallery, and the gallery can open a channel into any cell, and during intake we had left Subject Vance's channel open both ways, as we do with new arrivals, so that a physician can speak to a subject and a subject can answer. She had used it over those first cycles. Not to plead, which is what new arrivals use it for. She had used it to talk to the ring. She could hear the Cethal raider tearing himself apart through the shared gallery feed. We had, without thinking about it, given her ears on the whole ring, and she had been talking to him, talking to all of them. Low, steady, in that human register that the bridge rendered into flat cordon standard but that carried, under the flat words, a rhythm the bridge could not strip out. I pulled the logs. She had been talking almost without stopping for 4 cycles, telling the Cethal he was going to be all right. Telling the Aku to breathe with her. Counting, sometimes just counting slow, the way you would settle a frightened animal, except that the animals were sapient and caged and dying, and she was the only one on the tier treating them as though their fear were a thing that could be answered. I cut her channel, both directions, hard lock. I sealed her into silence, which is a cruelty we reserve for the most dangerous subjects, and I did it to a small human medic with clean panels, and I logged the reason as vector interdiction, and I told myself I would open it again when I understood the mechanism. The convergence slowed. It did not stop. That is the detail I need the board to sit with, because it is where my understanding of the world began to come apart. I took away her voice. the only channel I could find, the only road that made physical sense, and the entrainment on the ring slowed by perhaps a third, and then continued. The 5 caged animals kept folding toward a rhythm they could no longer hear. I had cut the wire and the current kept flowing, and there is no honest way to describe what that does to a man who has spent his life believing that if you cut the wire the current stops. Dahl thinks, and I have come to agree with him, that by the time I cut the channel the thing was already established, that the voice was only the seed, and that once the ring had begun to breathe with her, the ring sustained itself, each caged animal now entraining to its neighbor as much as to her, the rhythm propagating cell to cell along the ring the way a fold propagates through a sheet once you have started it, needing no further push from the center. I had been thinking of her as a source that I could switch off. She was not a source. She was an ignition, and you cannot unignite a thing by removing the match after the field is already burning. Marshall Case asked me in the preliminary hearing why I did not simply remove the subject, transfer her off the tier, break the ring's center, let the entrainment decay. It is a fair question, and I will answer it plainly. I did try. On the 11th cycle, I ordered subject Vance moved to a hard cell in the 3rd ring, isolated on all sides by empty cells, as far from any other subject as the architecture allowed. I intended to strand the vector in a desert where it had nothing to infect. The transfer required 2 wardens to enter her cell atmosphere in full containment and walk her through the triple lock, ordinary procedure. I had done it 1,000 times through other men's hands. The 2 wardens I assigned were experienced, hard, unbothered by caged things. One of them had walked the Corvin thing to disposal without his rhythm changing by a beat, and I have his telemetry to prove it. They went into her cell tense, as you should be, and they came out of her cell changed, and I have that telemetry too. I watched it happen from the gallery. She did not resist. She stood when they entered, held out her arms for the restraints, said something the bridge rendered as "thank you for coming to get me," which is not a thing a prisoner says to her jailers, and walked between them with her small human shoulders loose and her small human face doing the soft, sorry thing it had done at intake. And on the walk I watched the traces in real time. I want that in the record on the walk from the 2nd ring to the 3rd, across 90 measures of corridor, the 2 wardens' hearts slowed to match her step. By the time they reached the 3rd ring cell they were breathing with her. One of them, the veteran, the one who had walked the Corvin thing without a flutter, stood at the new cell after she was sealed inside and did not want to leave. He told his section chief later that he could not explain it, that the corridor near her cell felt safe in a way the rest of the tier did not, and that he had wanted to sit down against her field and stay. He requested reassignment off the 3rd ring the next cycle. I granted it. It did not help him. Whatever she had put in him did not wash out with distance. I had moved the source to a desert, and the desert had caught. That was the cycle I convened the board. Not because I understood it. I want to be clear that on the day I called this hearing I did not understand it. I only understood that I had a vector loose on my tier that crossed sealed fields, ignored dead channels, and infected the men I sent to contain it, and that nothing in the cordon catalog described it. I called the board because I had run out of walls, and a physician who has run out of walls is obligated to say so out loud before the thing he cannot contain reaches the door. We spent the next 9 cycles trying to characterize it, and those 9 cycles are the reason I can now tell you what it is. We tried to filter it. This is reflexive. When you cannot stop a thing at the wall, you try to strip it from the medium. But there was no medium. We passed her atmosphere through the full scrubber stack, the same stack that takes the 9-fold rod out of the air, and the entrainment on the tier did not change because the entrainment was not in the air. We sterilized her cell surfaces on a cycle that would have killed anything that lives, and it did not change because it was not on the surfaces. We put her behind full opacity so that no subject and no warden could see her, and it did not change because it did not need light. Every road we knew to close, we closed, and behind every closed road the rhythm went on propagating, the tier growing quieter and steadier by the cycle. The caged animals in the second ring now sleeping, through an isolation that had been tearing them apart the week before. Dahl was the one who finally stopped looking for the road and started looking at the thing that traveled. He asked a question that no containment physician asks, because it is not a containment question. He asked what the vector was made of, not how it moved, what it was. And to answer it, he did something I would not have authorized if I had been thinking clearly, which is that he sent a technician into Subject Vance's cell atmosphere with no task except to sit in it for 1 hour and be monitored. A live human exposure with no protective rationale. On paper it is a violation and Marshall case may log it as one. In practice, it was the only experiment that told us the truth, and the technician volunteered, and I let it happen, and I would let it happen again. The technician was a young serologist named Ith, chosen because his baseline telemetry was the most stable on my staff. A placid, unshakable animal, the kind of technician you want on a bad night because nothing moves him. We put him in her cell with a monitor and a chair and instructions to observe and say nothing, and we watched. For the first quarter he sat rigid and afraid, as any sane person would, sealed in a small room with a death-world organism. His telemetry was high and jagged. Subject Vance looked at him. I have the interior record, and she did not perform anything, did not soothe, did not speak, because we had ordered silence. She simply sat across from him and breathed, slow and deep and even, in the rhythm that by then I could have drawn from memory. And over the hour, with no word exchanged, no contact, no channel but the shared air of a sealed room, young Ith's jagged trace smoothed. His breathing lengthened. His heart fell into her cadence. By the end of the hour, the 2 traces in that cell were as close to one line as 2 different species can make. And when we brought Ith out through the lock, he was calm in a way that frightened his section chief more than any scream would have, because he could not tell us why. He said only that it was easier to breathe in there. In a sealed cell, with a death-world human, at the center of a containment failure, it was easier to breathe. That is when I understood, and I will tell the board exactly what I understood, because it is the finding, and everything in my report descends from it. We had been hunting an organism because we are a cordon and organisms are what we know. But the vector was not an organism. It never was. The thing that crossed my sealed fields, that survived the cut channel, that infected my hardest wardens and smoothed my most placid technician, was not a pathogen the human carried. It was the human. It was a property of what humans are. Their species does not simply feel. Ours feel, every sapient thing feels. But we feel privately, each animal sealed in its own weather, and when we are afraid our fear stays in us behind our own field, and a room full of frightened sayar is only a collection of separate frightened sayar, each alone. Humans are not sealed. A human's internal state is not private property. It broadcasts. It reaches out through voice and through breath, and through the set of the shoulders, and through 100 channels below the level any of us can name, and it reaches into every nervous system in range, and it pulls that system toward its own rhythm. A frightened human makes a room afraid. And a calm human, a steady, deep, unbreakable, deliberate human calm makes a room calm, and it does it whether the room consents or not, whether there is a wall or not, whether you have cut the channel or sterilized the air or sealed the cell, because the channel it uses is the shared fact of having a nervous system at all, and I cannot build a wall against that. No one can. There is no filter for it. There is no lock on it. It is not in the air. It is in the wiring of every listening mind, and Subject Vance was simply, without effort, without even intending it, playing every wired mind on my tier like they were all one instrument. We had caged a human expecting a disease, and the disease was her calm, and it was spreading through my quarantine exactly like a plague, and there was nothing in 40 years of my work that could touch it. I want to tell the board the part of this that I find hardest to file, because it is not in the telemetry and it belongs in the record anyway. I spoke to her after I understood. I opened her channel. The interdiction was pointless by then, the horse long past the gate, and I sat in my gallery and I asked her, physician to subject, what she thought she was doing to my tear. I expected, I think, some kind of admission, some technique, some human trick she could be made to stop performing. She was quiet for a moment, and then she asked me if the ones in the other cells were all right. She had been sealed in silence and opacity for cycles, and the first thing she wanted, when I finally spoke to her, was to know whether the Cethel raider had stopped hurting himself. When I told her he had, she was glad, and her gladness went through the tear like weather, and I watched 6 traces deepen on my board while she was simply glad. I asked her again, "What are you doing to them?" And she did not understand the question. She said she wasn't doing anything. She said they were scared and alone, and she just talked to them at first until we cut that, and then she just tried to stay calm so they could feel that somebody wasn't panicking. She said it the way a person tells you something so obvious they are embarrassed to be asked. She said when you're the medic, you can't lose it, because if you lose it, everybody loses it, so you just don't. You hold steady and it holds them. She had learned it, she said, pulling wounded soldiers out of fire, where the only medicine she sometimes had was her own refusal to be afraid where they could see it. She thought she was describing her job. She was describing the most efficient behavioral vector the cordon has ever isolated, and she thought it was too small a thing to mention. That is the human trait, and I have put it in the report in these words. They cannot be quarantined, because the thing that makes them dangerous is the thing that makes them able to save each other, and it is the same thing, and it is always running, and it does not have an off state. A frightened human spreads terror. A steady human spreads the strength to endure. And you do not get to choose which humans you cage, and even if you caged only the calm ones, you would find, as I found, that their calm gets out. It always gets out. It got out of the finest containment in the cordon through walls I signed the tolerances on myself, and it turned my screaming tear into the quietest ring at Vault Sarn, and every filter I own is useless against it, because you cannot filter a thing out of the air that was never in the air. Marshall Case asked the practical question at the close of the last session, and I owe the board a practical answer, so I will end on it and then I will file. He asked how many humans the cordon currently holds in isolation across all facilities. The number, as of this hearing, is high. We have been flagging them as pathogen vectors for as long as we have been meeting them, and we have been putting them into cells like mine, alone, sealed, each one at the center of a ring of other caged and frightened things. And I have had to write, in the finding, the sentence that I think is the reason this hearing was worth convening, that every one of those cells is not a quarantine. It is a broadcast station, that we have spent years taking the most dangerous stabilizing agent known to us and installing it, at cordon expense, in the center of every population of frightened prisoners we maintain. That whatever quiet, whatever endurance, whatever refusal to break has been spreading through our holding facilities for years, we built the delivery system ourselves, and we called it isolation, and we congratulated ourselves on the walls. There is no containment protocol at the end of this report. I want the board to understand that, because you will expect one, and I have failed to write one, and the failure is not mine. You cannot contain a species whose interior reaches into yours across any wall you can build. You can only decide whether you would rather have their terror or their calm loose in your facilities, because you are going to have one or the other. Those are the only 2 settings, and you do not control the switch, they do, and they do not even know it is a switch. I have decided, for what one physician's decision is worth, that I would rather have the calm. I have recommended that Subject Vance be repatriated, not disposed. Not out of mercy, though I will not pretend there is none in it. Out of the arithmetic in the finding. A caged human spreads her steadiness through the bars whether you will it or not. A freed one carries it home. And a species that carries that home, that walks into every frightened room it finds and without trying, without even noticing, makes the room able to stand, is not a species you quarantine. It is a species you are very, very careful never to make afraid. File it under active. Leave the case open. She is on the repatriation cutter as I speak, and I have already had 3 reports from the flight crew, and all 3 say the same thing in the same clipped hand my cutter medic used at the start of all this, months ago, before I knew what I was reading. They say the hold is quiet, and no one can tell them why, and they cannot make it stop. I could have told them at the beginning. I have written it now at the end, where it belongs, in the only sentence the board needs to carry out of this room. We spent 40 years learning to keep the terrible things in, and the day one walked into our care with her arms out and her small, steady breath, we learned there is a kind of terrible we were never built to keep out, and we have been sheltering it, cell by quiet cell, the whole time.